Charleston, South Carolina, March 17, 1839. An elderly enslaved woman named Patience tends a garden behind the Rutledge estate, humming spirituals while her spade strikes earth that refuses to settle. 6 prominent plantation owners have vanished without trace in 18 months, all last seen entering properties where this woman worked. When authorities finally excavate her carefully tended flower beds, they discover something that will haunt Charleston's elite for generations. Wooden boxes buried vertically, crude air holes drilled in the tops, and inside each one, the contorted remains of men who clawed at the wood until their fingers broke, men who screamed into dirt-packed coffins until their voices gave out, men who took 3 to 7 days to die in absolute darkness, 6 feet under her prize-winning roses. How does a 62-year-old enslaved woman overpower, drug, bury alive, and tend the graves of 6 wealthy white men without a single neighbor, family member, or fellow enslaved person noticing? This isn't a story about a serial killer. This is a story about a woman who had been systematically brutalized for 47 years, who watched her children sold away one by one, who endured unspeakable violence, and who, when the legal system, the church, and society itself offered her no protection, took justice into her own hands using the only weapon she had, their absolute certainty that she was harmless. Before we continue, I need you to subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you want access to exclusive uncensored videos about the world's most brutal crimes, consider becoming a member. And don't forget to hit the like button. Charleston in 1839 was a city of contrasts so stark they seemed deliberately constructed to mock reality. The cobblestone streets of the French Quarter gleamed after afternoon rains, reflecting the gaslights that illuminated evening promenades where ladies in silk gowns floated past wrought iron gates concealing horrors their parasols never shaded them from. The air carried the scent of jasmine and honeysuckle from manicured gardens, mingling with the salt wind off the harbor where slave ships still anchored, despite the 1808 importation ban, because laws, you have to understand, were for people the law recognized as people. The city's wealth was built on rice, indigo, and cotton, crops that required the systematic brutalization of human beings who were bought, sold, bred, and worked to death with the same casual cruelty plantation owners applied to livestock. In the elegant drawing rooms of Meeting Street, Charleston's elite discussed philosophy, poetry, and the civilizing mission of slavery while, in the quarters behind their homes, women were raped, children were torn from their mothers' arms and sold, and men were whipped until the flesh fell from their backs. The Second Great Awakening had swept through the South, producing a religious fervor that somehow convinced slaveholders that Christianity sanctified their dominion over other human beings. This was the world Patience was born into in 1777, a world that told her every single day that her pain didn't matter, that her humanity was negotiable, that her suffering was the price of civilization. The 6 men who would eventually suffocate in Patience's garden were pillars of Charleston society, the kind of men whose names appeared in newspapers praising their civic contributions and Christian charity. Thomas Rutledge owned the estate where Patience had worked for 32 years, a lawyer who had argued eloquently before the state legislature about the moral imperative of slavery, who attended First Presbyterian Church every Sunday, whose wife hosted temperance society meetings in their parlor. He had a reputation for being a fair master, which in Charleston meant he usually waited until his slaves made mistakes before beating them. Jonathan Whitmore was a rice planter, whose fortune was built on the labor of 200 enslaved people working waist-deep in malarial swamps. He was known for his poetry and his patronage of the arts. Dr. Samuel Hayward was a physician respected throughout the South, who had published papers on the medical management of the Negro Constitution that justified brutal working conditions as biologically appropriate. Captain James Middleton had commanded a merchant vessel and now managed the city's slave market, where he conducted sales with the efficiency of a stockyard auctioneer. Reverend Elias Horry preached about Christian submission and the curse of Ham every Sunday, providing theological justification for the system that enriched his congregation. And finally, Judge Marcus Pinckney, whose courtroom had sent dozens of enslaved people to the gallows for crimes as minor as stealing food, who had never once convicted a white man for killing a slave. These men moved through Charleston with absolute confidence in their righteousness, their power, and their invulnerability. When these prominent men began disappearing, the explanations came readily and were accepted without question because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. Thomas Rutledge, everyone agreed, had finally made good on his frequent threats to travel to his brother's plantation in Georgia to resolve a property dispute, though it was odd he hadn't told his wife or business partners, odd that he'd left at night, odd that he'd taken neither luggage nor horse. Jonathan Whitmore's disappearance was attributed to his known drinking problem. Surely he'd stumbled drunk into the harbor one foggy evening. a tragic accident that befell gentlemen of leisure with alarming regularity. Dr. Hayward had been called away on an urgent medical emergency to Columbia, or so a note in his own handwriting claimed. Never mind that no one in Columbia had summoned him. Never mind that his medical bag remained in his office. Captain Middleton, people whispered, had likely returned to the sea, unable to resist the call of adventure despite his age, though his ship remained docked. His crews uncontacted, his finances in perfect order. Reverend Horry's disappearance was the most troubling to the congregation, but eventually they convinced themselves he'd embarked on a missionary journey to convert the Creek Indians, a dangerous but holy calling. And Judge Pinckney, well, perhaps he'd finally retired to his country estate to escape the summer heat, though summer was months away and he'd mentioned no such plans. The genius of these explanations was that they required no investigation, no uncomfortable questions, no examination of who might want these men gone. Charleston society accepted the disappearances, because accepting them was easier than facing the truth. What made Patience's methodical elimination of these 6 men possible was the very system designed to control her, a bourgeois system so convinced of its own supremacy that it became blind to the intelligence, patience, and rage of those it enslaved. The Rutledge estate, like most Charleston properties, was a compound with the main house fronting the street and, behind it, a separate kitchen building, laundry, stables, and slave quarters arranged around a large garden where Patience had worked for 3 decades. The garden was her domain, her responsibility, and therefore invisible to the white family who enjoyed its flowers, but never questioned how they grew. She had access to the root cellar where wine was stored, to the main house through the kitchen entrance, to the various outbuildings where tools, rope, and supplies were kept. More importantly, she had access to something far more valuable, trust built through years of perfect subservience, of calling these men master with downcast eyes, of playing the role of the loyal, simple-minded old servant so convincingly that they forgot she was human, forgot she could plan, forgot she could hate. The enslaved community operated its own underground communication network, songs that carried warnings, quilts hung in windows that signaled danger, innocuous conversations that contained coded messages. Patience could move through this system requesting help with gardening projects without anyone understanding the true nature of what she was planting. She'd learned carpentry by watching repairs, learned about human anatomy from years of treating injuries the masters ignored, learned about poisons from the same medicinal herbs she grew for the white family. The infrastructure of slavery itself became her weapon. When concerned family members or business associates began noticing disturbing patterns, men disappearing after visiting properties where Patience worked, the unusual timing of these vanishings, the convenient explanations that never quite added up, Charleston's authorities offered reassurances that revealed more about the system's arrogance than its competence. City Marshal William Trescott investigated the disappearances with the thoroughness you'd apply to finding a lost dog. He interviewed white witnesses only, accepting their testimony as gospel while never once questioning the enslaved people who might have seen something. When Mrs. Rutledge mentioned that her husband had seemed nervous before disappearing, meeting secretly with someone in the garden at dusk, Marshal Trescott suggested it was probably a business associate and dropped that line of inquiry entirely. When Dr. Hayward's colleagues noted that the handwriting on his supposed departure note seemed shaky, authorities concluded he must have written it while ill, not that someone might have forced him to write it at knife point. The official explanation for any oddities was always some variation of gentlemen sometimes behave unpredictably, or men of affairs have secret business we cannot know. The possibility that an enslaved woman could be involved never entered the discussion because, in the minds of Charleston's elite, enslaved people were incapable of such sophisticated planning. They were tools, livestock, children in adult bodies requiring white guidance. This fundamental misunderstanding of the humanity, intelligence, and capacity for strategic thinking possessed by those they enslaved created a blind spot large enough to hide 6 murders. The authorities saw what they expected to see: mysterious disappearances that had nothing to do with the invisible people who cleaned the houses, cooked the food, and tended the gardens. Now, you have to understand, Patience didn't work alone, though she bore the weight of the planning and execution. There was Moses, an enslaved carpenter at the Middleton estate who built the coffins without knowing their purpose, or so he would later claim. Patience had approached him with a story about needing boxes for storing root vegetables, offering him 3 silver coins she'd somehow acquired. The dimensions she specified were odd, tall and narrow, with ventilation holes near the top, but Moses had learned long ago not to ask questions that might get him whipped. There was Delilah, an enslaved woman who worked in the Hayward household, who provided information about the doctor's schedule and habits. Delilah had her own reasons for hating Hayward. He'd performed experimental surgeries on her sister, testing theories about pain tolerance in enslaved people, procedures that left her sister maimed and half-mad. When patients asked casual questions about when the doctor took his evening walks, about whether he kept weapons in his study, Delilah answered truthfully and asked nothing in return. There was Isaac, who drove wagons between plantations and could transport heavy loads through the city at night without attracting attention because enslaved people moving through darkness were assumed to be on their master's business. And there was Reverend Josiah, a free black minister who operated an underground church, who knew secrets the white world would never hear, who provided patience with something she needed more than accomplices: spiritual justification. He never told her to kill. That would come later in testimony designed to save his own life. But he did tell her that God heard the cries of the oppressed, that sometimes deliverance required action, that the Bible was full of stories where the enslaved rose up against their captors. These people existed in Patience's orbit, providing pieces of the puzzle without necessarily seeing the complete picture. Let's be real about something. Calling these men victims requires us to ignore the victims they themselves created daily. But to understand this story, we need to know who they were beyond their public personas, what made them targets, what connected them. The 6 men shared more than social status. They were part of an informal club that met monthly at Rutledge's estate to discuss, as they put it, the Negro problem. These meetings, which they believed were private, were in fact overheard by Patience as she served brandy and cigars. What she heard in those meetings would have justified murder in any moral universe. They discussed breeding programs, debating which enslaved women to force together to produce stronger workers. They shared techniques for breaking the spirit of troublesome slaves, methods involving sensory deprivation, family separation, and calculated cruelty. They laughed about rapes they'd committed, comparing enslaved women like men might compare horses. They planned a petition to the legislature to make manumission even more difficult, to close the few pathways to freedom that existed. And they discussed a specific problem: Patience herself. She was getting old, less useful, and her presence on the estate was a financial drain. Rutledge had been considering selling her to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, a death sentence for someone her age. The others encouraged this decision, suggesting that old slaves who'd outlived their usefulness should be disposed of efficiently. Patience heard her own death warrant being signed over brandy and cigars. These men weren't random victims. They were the architects of her suffering, and they'd made the fatal mistake of discussing their plans within earshot of someone they considered too old, too broken, too simple to understand or act on what she heard. Everything might have continued indefinitely, if not for Timothy Sullivan, a 19-year-old Irish immigrant who worked as a groundskeeper at the estate neighboring Rutledge's property. Sullivan had come to Charleston fleeing famine, desperate enough to take any work, and found himself trapped in a city whose hierarchy placed even poor whites above enslaved blacks, but offered him little more than survival wages and contempt from the established families. On the night of March 15, 1839, Sullivan was working late, clearing brush from a fence line that bordered Rutledge's garden. The moon was full, casting sharp shadows through the magnolia trees, and Sullivan was tired, sweating despite the cool evening, thinking about the boarding house dinner he'd missed for this work. Then he heard something that made his blood freeze, a muffled scream, cut short, followed by a sound like a heavy sack being dragged across gravel. He crouched behind the fence, peering through gaps in the wood, and saw Patience, old Patience, who he'd exchanged greetings with dozens of times, who seemed like every grandmother he'd left behind in Ireland, dragging something wrapped in canvas toward a freshly dug hole in the garden. The canvas was moving. Sullivan watched, paralyzed by disbelief and terror, as Patience maneuvered what was clearly a person in a wooden box into the vertical hole, as she picked up a speaking trumpet and placed it against the air holes, as she whispered something he couldn't hear. Then she began shoveling dirt, working with a speed and efficiency that spoke of practice. Sullivan wanted to believe he was dreaming, that whiskey or exhaustion had conjured this nightmare. But the sounds were too real, the thud of earth on wood, the muffled screaming from underground that grew fainter as the hole filled, and most horrible of all, Patience's voice, singing a spiritual about freedom coming to God's children. Timothy Sullivan ran. He ran through the streets of Charleston like demons pursued him, gasping and sobbing, until he burst into the city marshal's office at nearly midnight, babbling about murder and gardens and old women burying people alive. Marshal Trescott, who'd been sleeping off bourbon at his desk, listened to Sullivan's hysterical account with increasing irritation. Here was a drunk Irishman, barely more respectable than the slaves he was accusing, making wild claims about a Negro woman, a woman, mind you, who was 62 years old and weighed perhaps 90 pounds, overpowering and burying white men. The story was absurd on its face. Trescott told Sullivan to sleep it off, to stop wasting his time with fantasies, to remember that false accusations against white property, which is how he referred to Patience, could result in legal consequences. Sullivan spent the next 2 days trying to convince anyone who would listen, but he was Irish, poor, and hysterical. 3 strikes that rendered his testimony worthless in Charleston's hierarchy. He approached the church, but Reverend Cathcart suggested he was suffering from delirium brought on by malnutrition and overwork. He tried to tell his employer, who threatened to fire him for spreading vicious gossip that could damage property values. Sullivan began to doubt his own sanity, wondering if he truly had imagined it, if the stress of survival in a strange land had broken something in his mind. He started drinking heavily, taking laudanum to sleep, waking up screaming from nightmares where dirt filled his mouth and darkness pressed against his eyes. 3 weeks after witnessing Patience's crime, Sullivan attempted suicide by walking into the Cooper River with stones in his pockets. He was pulled out by dock workers and committed to the Charleston Lunatic Asylum, where his delusions about garden murders were treated with cold baths, restraints, and isolation. The system had successfully neutralized the one witness who could have stopped Patience months earlier. The official inquiry into the disappearances, such as it was, consisted of Marshal Trescott visiting the estates where the men were last seen, asking perfunctory questions of white staff members, and filing reports that concluded no evidence of foul play. The investigation was designed to fail because a successful investigation would force uncomfortable questions about security, about the trustworthiness of the enslaved people working in every elite home, about the vulnerability of men who believed themselves untouchable. When Mrs. Rutledge insisted something was wrong, that her husband would never abandon his practice and property, Trescott suggested marital troubles might explain his departure, an insinuation that outraged her into silence. When business partners demanded answers about Judge Pinckney's disappearance, they were told investigations were ongoing while no actual investigative work occurred. The genius of the system's response was maintaining plausible deniability for everyone involved. If the men were truly dead, someone was responsible, and that responsibility might extend to the city's failure to maintain order. Better to accept mysterious disappearances than confront the possibility that Charleston's enslaved population might be capable of organized resistance. The inquiry interviewed dozens of white witnesses, but only 3 enslaved people, and those interviews consisted of questions designed to confirm predetermined conclusions rather than uncover truth. Have you seen your master recently? No, sir. Do you know where he went? No, sir. Did anything unusual happen? No, sir. The investigators never asked the right questions, never searched the properties thoroughly, never considered that the answer might be literally under their feet. In official reports, the disappearances were attributed to unknown causes and filed away, unsolved and eventually forgotten by everyone except the families left behind. This is where the story gets truly chilling. There were witnesses to Patience's crimes, living evidence walking through Charleston's streets, but they'd been so thoroughly broken by the system that their testimony was worthless. 3 enslaved people at various estates had witnessed parts of Patience's operation, had seen her luring men into buildings, had heard muffled sounds from the garden at night, had noticed fresh dirt covering areas that had been undisturbed days before, but speaking up meant certain death or worse. An enslaved person who accused a white person of crime, even with proof, faced immediate execution or sale to the brutal sugar plantations of the Deep South, where life expectancy was measured in seasons. So they remained silent, and their silence manifested as trauma that showed in their eyes, in their jumpiness, in their nightmares that had them screaming in the quarters at night. Overseer Henry Wilkins noted in his journal that several slaves at the Rutledge estate had become melancholy and fearful after Rutledge's disappearance, refusing to work in the garden, crossing themselves when passing patients. He attributed this to superstitious nature rather than recognition that they were living beside a serial killer. One enslaved woman named Ruth, who worked alongside patients, began having fits where she would scream about men in the ground, still breathing, still crying. She was treated for hysteria with beatings designed to drive out evil spirits. The altered victims, those traumatized witnesses who survived, walked through Charleston carrying the truth in their bodies, in their terror, in their shattered sleep patterns. But the system refused to read the evidence written in their trauma because acknowledging that evidence would require acknowledging their humanity. Let's talk about exactly how patients did it, because her methodology was sophisticated, calculated, and revealed an intelligence that the white men who enslaved her never imagined she possessed. First, she studied her targets for weeks, learning their routines, their weaknesses, their vices. She knew that Rutledge took brandy in the garden after dinner every Wednesday. She knew that Dr. Hayward compulsively checked on the medicinal herb garden she maintained. She knew that Judge Pinckney met secretly with enslaved women he was raping, thinking the garden provided privacy. She exploited their arrogance. They never imagined she was dangerous, never imagined she was watching, never imagined their simple old patients had been documenting their patterns with the attention of a hunter studying prey. Second, she used their own medicine against them. The estate's medicine cabinet contained laudanum, chloroform, and other substances used to manage pain in enslaved workers injured during labor. She learned dosages by watching Dr. Hayward treat patients, learned how much would cause unconsciousness versus death. She drugged them with compounds mixed into brandy, into food, delivered with a trusted smile. Third, she prepared meticulously. Moses built her 6 narrow coffins over 2 years, each one with air holes drilled near the top, enough to keep someone alive for days, not enough to provide comfort. She dug graves during the day, disguising them as preparation for new plantings, working in plain sight because nobody questioned a slave gardening. Fourth, she trapped them. Once drugged unconscious, she bound them, placed them in the coffins, and lowered them into the pre-dug vertical graves. She would lean over the air holes and tell them exactly why they were there, listing their crimes, naming the children they'd sold, describing the rapes they'd committed. Then she filled in the earth slowly, letting them hear their own burial, letting them understand that their power had finally failed them. If this story has a hero, it's someone who will complicate your understanding of that word, Benjamin Carter. A 34-year-old formerly enslaved man who'd purchased his freedom 10 years earlier by working as a skilled blacksmith, who now operated his own small forge on the edge of Charleston's commercial district. Carter existed in the liminal space between slavery and freedom that the South barely tolerated. Legally free but constantly harassed, economically independent but socially powerless, educated but forced to perform illiteracy around whites who found reading Negroes threatening. He was known in both communities. White Charleston hired him for quality metalwork they couldn't get elsewhere, and enslaved Charleston trusted him as someone who understood their reality while navigating the free world. Carter had his own demons. He'd purchased his freedom by abandoning his wife and children in slavery, saving himself because saving all of them was impossible, a decision that haunted every night of his life. When he heard whispers in the enslaved community about strange happenings at the Rutledge estate, about white men disappearing, about patients tending a garden that sang at night, Carter initially dismissed it as folk stories, the kind of revenge fantasies enslaved people told each other to survive. But the stories persisted, grew more detailed, and Carter began to wonder if something was actually happening, and if so, whether it should be stopped or allowed to continue. This ambivalence is important. Carter wasn't motivated by justice for the missing white men. He was motivated by fear of collective punishment, by the knowledge that when white men went missing, the response was often brutal reprisals against the entire black community. His heroism, such as it was, wasn't about saving oppressors. It was about protecting his people from the inevitable backlash. Carter began his investigation carefully, using his unique position to move between worlds. He visited the Rutledge estate under the pretense of repairing ironwork on the garden gate, observing Patience as she worked, noting the areas of the garden that seemed oddly bare despite the season, noticing how she directed other enslaved workers away from specific plots. He spoke with Moses, the carpenter, asking about recent work, learning about the strange vegetable storage boxes he'd built. He attended Reverend Josiah's underground church, listening to coded sermons about deliverance and freedom, hearing the spiritual songs that contained messages only the enslaved community understood. He talked to Ruth, the enslaved woman who'd been having fits, sitting with her in the darkness behind the slave quarters, listening to her fragmented testimony about what she'd seen and heard. Carter also observed White Charleston's response: the lack of serious investigation, the easy acceptance of implausible explanations, the complete dismissal of Timothy Sullivan's testimony. He began to understand that Patience had exposed a fundamental truth about the system. It was so convinced of its own superiority, so certain that enslaved people were incapable of sophisticated resistance, that it couldn't recognize an organized campaign of revenge happening in plain sight. Carter found himself torn between conflicting imperatives. Part of him wanted to stop Patience before her actions triggered brutal reprisals. Part of him wanted to let her continue, to let these men face consequences for their crimes. Part of him wanted to warn other potential victims in Charleston's elite that their slaves were watching, learning, planning. But mostly, Carter wanted evidence. Proof that would protect the enslaved community by showing that this was one woman's vengeance, not a general uprising. Proof that might prevent mass retaliation. Now I need to ask you something. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling. Where we stop dealing with theories and start confronting evidence. Where the garden gives up its secrets and Charleston faces a truth it desperately wants to deny. What you're about to hear isn't speculation. It's documented in trial transcripts, in newspaper accounts that editors tried to suppress, in medical examiner reports that describe in clinical detail what happens to the human body when it's buried alive. Before we continue, I want you to think about your own assumptions. How would you judge Patience? Is what she did murder or justice? Is Carter a hero for trying to stop her or a traitor to his own people? There are no easy answers here, and that's precisely why this story matters. If you're still with me, if you're ready to see this through, then let's continue. Subscribe if you haven't already. Because stories like this, stories that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, revenge, and the systems that drive people to desperate acts, are what this channel is about. On March 16, 1839, Benjamin Carter made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He approached Marshal Trescott with specific information: check the Rutledge garden, dig beneath the rose beds, look for vertical disturbances in the soil. Trescott initially dismissed Carter the same way he'd dismissed Sullivan, but Carter played to the marshal's fears rather than his conscience. If something is happening and it comes out you were warned, how will that look? Carter asked. If there's nothing there, you've lost an afternoon. If there is something, and Charleston finds out you ignored a warning, you'll be the one blamed for letting white men die. The logic was sound enough that Trescott assembled a team, 2 deputies, a doctor, and 4 hired laborers to do the actual digging. They arrived at the Rutledge estate at dawn on March 17th with shovels and lanterns. Patience was already in the garden, tending early spring vegetables, humming to herself. When Trescott announced they needed to search the property, she simply nodded and stepped aside, showing no fear, no surprise, no emotion at all. The diggers started with the rosebed, the one that had won prizes for unusual vigor, for blooms that grew larger and more abundant than any other in Charleston. 3 feet down, a shovel struck wood. The sound it made was hollow, wrong, and the diggers looked at each other with growing dread. They cleared dirt away from what turned out to be a lid with air holes drilled in the top. When they pried it open, the smell that emerged sent 2 men running to vomit in the bushes. The sweet rot smell of advanced decomposition, mixed with human waste and something else, something like desperation and terror given olfactory form. Inside was Thomas Rutledge, or what remained of him. His fingers were bloody stumps where he'd clawed at the wood. His jaw was dislocated from screaming. His eyes were still open, fixed upward toward the air holes that had given him just enough oxygen to make his death last 3 agonizing days. The moment the first coffin was opened, Patience ran. Not the shuffling run of an elderly woman, but the purposeful sprint of someone who'd planned this contingency, who'd always known discovery was possible and had prepared an escape route. She headed not toward the city or the countryside, but toward the harbor, moving through alleys and back passages she'd mapped during decades of invisible servitude in Charleston. The deputies chased her, shouting for civilians to stop the murderous Negro woman. But Patience had advantages they didn't understand. The enslaved community that watched everything, that could signal warnings through subtle gestures, that could direct pursuers away with innocently given wrong information. She ran past loading docks where enslaved longshoremen suddenly dropped crates into the paths of her pursuers, past market stalls where enslaved vendors created momentary obstacles by stepping into the street to redirect confused horses. Benjamin Carter, who'd been present at the excavation, found himself running too, though he wasn't sure whether he was pursuing or escorting, protecting or capturing. Patience reached the waterfront and made for a small boat tied at a wharf where a free black sailor named William Jacobs kept a vessel he used for local fishing. Carter arrived just as Patience was pushing off, and for a moment their eyes met. She didn't plead, didn't explain, just looked at him with an expression that asked a single question. "Will you let me go?" Carter hesitated, that hesitation stretching into seconds that felt like hours. Seconds in which he weighed her crimes against the crimes committed against her, her violence against the systematic violence that created her. Then deputies rounded the corner, pistols drawn, and the moment evaporated. Carter stepped into the boat with Patience and wrestled her back to shore, not roughly but firmly whispering, "I'm sorry," as he did it. Those two words carrying the weight of everything he couldn't say about betrayal and survival and the impossible choices forced on them both. Back at the garden, the excavation continued and the horror multiplied. 6 coffins total, each containing a prominent Charleston man, each showing evidence of the victim's desperate attempts to escape. The pattern became clear. Patience had drugged them, buried them alive with just enough air to survive for days, and visited them regularly through the speaking trumpet pressed against the air holes. Witnesses would later testify that they'd heard her conducting conversations with the garden, that they'd thought she was praying or singing to herself, when she was actually talking to the dying men underground, telling them stories about the children they'd sold, about the women they'd raped, about the families they'd destroyed. She'd given each man time to understand exactly why this was happening, time to contemplate their crimes, time to experience powerlessness and terror and certain death, all feelings they'd inflicted casually on others for decades. When news of the discovery spread through Charleston, the reaction wasn't what you might expect. There was shock, certainly, and horror at the manner of death. But there was also something else, fierce resistance to the obvious conclusion. Many prominent citizens insisted that Patience couldn't possibly have done this alone, that there must be a conspiracy of enslaved people throughout Charleston plotting similar murders. Others insisted she must have been controlled by voodoo or dark magic, anything to avoid acknowledging that an enslaved woman could have planned and executed this campaign using nothing but intelligence, Patience, and her captor's own arrogance. The evidence of the garden contradicted the fundamental mythology of slavery, that enslaved people were childlike, simple, incapable of complex thought or long-term planning, that the system itself was benevolent and necessary. Patience's crimes proved that enslaved people were fully human, capable of love, hate, strategy, and revenge, which meant the entire justification for slavery collapsed. The official investigation that followed the garden's excavation revealed details Charleston's elite tried desperately to suppress. In Patience's quarters, a single room measuring 10 by 12 feet where she'd lived for 32 years, investigators found a journal. Not a diary, but a meticulous record of crimes committed by the 6 men and dozens of others in Charleston's elite, written in careful, elegant handwriting that shocked investigators who assumed enslaved people were illiterate. The journal documented rapes by date and victim name, children sold with transaction amounts, beatings with casualty numbers, and conversations overheard during monthly meetings where these men discussed the Negro problem. Patience had kept records like a naturalist keeps field notes, dispassionately recording observations of cruelty with the attention to detail of someone building a legal case, except no legal system would ever hear it. The journal also contained drawings, anatomical diagrams showing optimal drug dosages based on body weight, engineering drawings of the coffin design, maps of the garden with burial sites marked, schedules tracking each man's routines and vulnerabilities. This wasn't the work of a mad woman. This was premeditated, calculated, sophisticated revenge carried out over 18 months with the precision of a military campaign. The trial that followed forced Charleston to confront truths about the 6 dead men that polite society had always known but never acknowledged. Thomas Rutledge, the fair master, had fathered 11 children with enslaved women on his property, selling each child at age 8 to pay gambling debts while forcing the mothers to continue serving his wife's tea parties. Court documents revealed he'd participated in the 1822 conspiracy trials following Denmark Vesey's planned rebellion, personally torturing suspects using waterboarding, breaking fingers, and burning flesh with hot irons. Dr. Samuel Hayward's medical practice came under scrutiny, revealing decades of experimental surgeries performed on enslaved people without anesthesia, procedures he justified as advancing medical science while testing theories about racial differences in pain perception. His journals contained clinical descriptions of amputations, organ removals, and vivisections performed on living subjects. Judge Marcus Pinckney's court records showed a pattern of selective justice so egregious it shocked even slavery's defenders. He'd sentenced 17 enslaved people to death for stealing food while never once convicting a white person for killing a slave. Reverend Elias Horry's sermons revealed theology so twisted it redefined Christianity as white supremacy with a cross. Captain James Middleton's ledgers showed he'd knowingly separated over 300 families, including infants from nursing mothers. These weren't secrets. Everyone in Charleston's elite knew these men were monsters. But acknowledging it publicly meant acknowledging the entire system was monstrous. As investigators dug deeper, motivated by fear that Patience's example might inspire others, they uncovered something that terrified Charleston's elite far more than 6 murders. Patience hadn't acted in isolation. Her journal referenced a network of communication between enslaved people across multiple states, an underground information system that shared news of successful resistance, documented white families' vulnerabilities, and passed along techniques for subtle rebellion. References to Sister Margaret in Savannah and Brother Thomas in Richmond suggested coordinated resistance networks spanning the South. Interrogations of enslaved people at the Rutledge estate revealed that dozens had known about the murders, that a conspiracy of silence had protected Patience for 18 months, that the enslaved community had collectively decided these deaths were justified and worked together to ensure she wasn't discovered. This revelation shattered the comforting myth that enslaved people accepted their condition, that resistance was limited to rare, isolated incidents. The underground church network had been sharing information about successful escapes, vulnerable masters, and how to forge freedom papers. The quilts and windows weren't just decoration. They were coded messages about safe houses. The spirituals sung in fields contained information about patrol schedules and escape routes. Patience's crimes were shocking not because they were unprecedented, but because they'd been discovered. Charleston's elite realized they'd been living atop a volcano that could erupt at any moment. Here's what happened next, and this might be the most disturbing part. Charleston tried to bury it again. Not physically this time, but through systematic suppression of information. Newspaper editors met with city officials and agreed to minimize coverage, publishing brief accounts describing Patience as a deranged Negro woman acting alone due to mental deficiency, never mentioning the journal, the network, or the sophisticated planning. Out-of-state newspapers that sent reporters to cover the trial found themselves denied access to court documents, with local officials citing concerns about inciting slave rebellion through detailed coverage. The trial itself was conducted with unusual speed, 12 days from arrest to verdict, with key evidence excluded to prevent public discussion of the victims' crimes. Testimony about the medical experiments, the child sales, the systematic rapes was ruled irrelevant to Patience's guilt. The judge instructed the jury that regardless of any mistreatment Patience had suffered, murder remained. Murder, that enslaved people had no legal right to resist their masters violently, that accepting her actions would mean accepting the end of civilization itself. Enslaved witnesses were not allowed to testify at all, their potential testimony dismissed as legally invalid because South Carolina law prohibited enslaved people from testifying against whites, even in a case where a black defendant was being tried for killing white victims. Charleston collectively decided that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge, that maintaining the mythology of benevolent slavery mattered more than factual accuracy. Patience was convicted on April 2, 1839, after jury deliberations lasting 43 minutes. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 2 weeks to prevent her from becoming a martyr or symbol of resistance. But here's where the story takes another turn. Patience never made it to the gallows. On April 7th, 5 days before her scheduled execution, she was found dead in her cell at the Charleston workhouse, officially of natural causes, though she'd been in perfect health days before. No autopsy was performed, no investigation conducted. Most historians believe she was quietly murdered to prevent the public spectacle of her execution, which authorities feared might trigger demonstrations or riots. Some accounts suggest she was poisoned. Others claim she was beaten to death by guards. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Potter's Field, her location deliberately obscured to prevent the grave from becoming a pilgrimage site. Benjamin Carter faced his own reckoning. White Charleston viewed him with suspicion for being Patience's confidant. Black Charleston viewed him as a traitor for turning her in. His blacksmith business failed as both communities withdrew patronage. He left Charleston in 1841, heading north, becoming involved with the abolitionist movement, though he never spoke publicly about the Patience case. He died in 1867 in Philadelphia, his role forgotten by everyone except those who'd lived through it. The legacy of Patience's crimes rippled through Charleston and the broader South in ways still debated. In the immediate aftermath, security measures at plantations intensified dramatically. Enslaved people faced new restrictions on movement, harsher punishments, increased surveillance. Some historians argue Patience's actions, by terrifying the white population, actually made conditions worse for the enslaved community. Others argue she revealed the fundamental instability of the slavery system, proving that violence and control could never fully suppress human resistance, that even the most vulnerable person retained agency and capacity for rebellion. The moral isn't simple, and anyone who tries to make it simple is lying to you. Was Patience a hero or a murderer? The answer depends on whether you believe oppressed people have the right to violent resistance, whether systematic brutalization justifies systematic revenge, whether there's legitimate justice outside legal systems built to protect oppressors. What's undeniable? Patience spent 47 years being told she wasn't fully human, that her pain didn't matter, that her children could be sold like livestock. The legal system offered no protection. The church offered no solace beyond promises of heaven. And when men who'd brutalized her for decades planned to sell her to a death sentence, she made a choice to make her oppressors feel the terror they'd inflicted on countless others. So I want you to think about something, and be honest in the comments. Could this happen today? Not burial in gardens, but the fundamental dynamics. A system so convinced of its righteousness that it can't see the humanity of those it oppresses, can't imagine that powerless people might be watching, planning, waiting for their moment. Would we recognize if oppressed people in our society were documenting crimes, organizing networks, preparing for reckoning? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and Patience's story echoes through every system built on exploitation. Before you go, first subscribe because we tell stories others want forgotten, uncomfortable truths that challenge easy narratives. Second, comment how you judge Patience, murderer or freedom fighter, monster or martyr. Be honest about what your answer reveals. Third, share this video because this story needs remembering, needs to force us to confront questions about justice and revenge with no easy answers. Next time, the plantation doctor who kept a ward of living medical experiments in Louisiana, 1843, surgical horrors that make Patience's garden seem merciful. Remember, history is written by the powerful, but truth belongs to those brave enough to resist, regardless of cost. I'll see you in the next one.